Story number 1.
I never considered myself a believer in the supernatural. Raised in a home where every creak of the floorboards could be explained by the house settling and every shadow in the corner was just poor lighting, I had learned to dismiss strange occurrences as mere coincidence or the product of an overactive imagination. But that all changed the moment I moved into the house on Maple Street. The house was everything I had hoped for: spacious, charming, and at a price I could actually afford. It was an old two-story with a wraparound porch, nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gray, had passed away several months before I arrived, and the house had been on the market for some time. I hadn't thought much of it when I first toured the house. It felt normal. A bit aged, yes, but nothing that would make anyone believe the house was anything other than just another old home. I moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the air smells of dried leaves and the sky is a perfect shade of blue. As I unpacked, the house felt empty, like it was waiting for something. I dismissed the feeling as nerves. After all, it was my first time living alone, and the idea of having a place all to myself was both thrilling and a little unnerving. I attributed the discomfort to the silence and unfamiliarity of the space. The first few days passed without incident. I settled in, made the house my own. But then, on the fourth night, things began to change. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no apparent reason. The house was unnervingly still. I lay there in the darkness, trying to calm myself, but the sense that something was wrong was palpable. I turned toward the window, expecting to see the moonlight filtering through the curtains, but there was only darkness outside. My gaze shifted to the door, slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as my own forgetfulness. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the direction of the staircase. My heart skipped a beat. The house was old, but the sounds it made at night had never been this distinct. I strained my ears, listening intently. It was almost rhythmic, like the tapping of fingernails against wood. Slowly, I got out of bed and walked toward the door, the floor creaking beneath my feet with every step. The tapping continued, growing louder as I moved down the hallway. I reached the stairs, which seemed to stretch upward into an impenetrable blackness. A cold draft brushed against my skin as I descended the stairs, and the sound of the tapping grew louder still. I reached the foot of the stairs and stopped. There was no one there. I scanned the hallway and the living room, but the house was empty. The tapping had stopped. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My pulse was pounding in my ears. But after a few moments, I dismissed the incident as my mind playing tricks on me. I returned to bed, convincing myself that it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind making strange noises through the old windows. The next day, I chalked the experience up to exhaustion and moved on with my life. But the tapping didn't stop. It started again that night. The same faint tapping, this time accompanied by the sound of something scraping across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The scraping was slow and deliberate, like something or someone was dragging itself along the floor upstairs. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hand shaking as I crept toward the stairs. I was terrified, but something inside of me urged me to investigate. The house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the faint scraping, which had now turned into an unsettling dragging noise. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the darkness, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more the air around me felt heavy, thick, like something was watching me. I didn't want to go upstairs, but the noise was impossible to ignore. Slowly, I ascended the stairs, the flashlight beam flickering as I moved. The dragging noise stopped just as I reached the top, and the house fell into complete silence once more. I turned the corner into the hallway, my eyes darting from side to side, but the hallway was empty. The door to the guest room at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, but other than that, there was nothing. I approached the guest room with caution, my breath shallow. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Nothing. The room was just as it had been when I first moved in, dusty and empty. But then I saw it. At the far side of the room, near the closet, was a small, dark stain on the floor. It looked like something had been dragged across the wood, leaving behind a smudge of dirt and what appeared to be dark liquid. I knelt down to inspect it more closely, but I recoiled as the smell hit me. It was metallic like rust and sharp, almost nauseating. My stomach turned. I backed away from the stain, trying to shake the image from my mind. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, but as I turned to leave the room, I heard something. A voice. It was soft, a whisper almost, but it was unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was faint, as though it was coming from far away or from behind a thick wall. I turned toward the closet, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Please, help me." I bolted from the room, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house and standing on the porch, gasping for air. My mind raced. I had to be imagining things. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this, some kind of trick of the mind, a result of the stress of moving and adjusting to a new life. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. There was something in the house, something that was trying to reach me, trying to tell me something. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the porch, shivering in the cold air, watching the house, waiting for something to happen. I could feel its presence. The house was alive with it, the energy thick in the air. The next day, I did something I had never thought I'd do. I reached out to Mrs. Gray's family. I had to know if anyone else had experienced anything like this, if there was any history to the house that I was missing. Mrs. Gray's daughter, Julia, responded almost immediately, and when we spoke on the phone, she sounded hesitant. "I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this," she said softly. "I didn't want to burden you with the details. The house has a history. My mother, she believed that the house was haunted. She told me stories of strange things happening when she was younger, things she couldn't explain. My mother was never one to believe in ghosts, but after my father passed, she started to change. She became obsessed with the house, with its history." She paused, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "There was a tragedy," Julia continued. "A long time ago, before my mother ever moved in, a young woman named Elizabeth lived in the house. She was pregnant, but her fiancé disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. The story goes that she went mad, waiting for him, pacing the floors, dragging herself from room to room. Some say she died in the house, but no one ever found her body." I listened in stunned silence as Julia spoke, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. I had no idea if this was connected to what I had experienced, but something told me it was. "Elizabeth's spirit never left," Julia said, her voice trembling. "My mother felt it, and I think you are too. That night, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, not with the knowledge that something was lingering there, waiting. I packed my things and left before sunrise, never looking back. I haven't spoken to Julia since that night, and I don't know if anyone else has moved into the house. But every now and then, I hear the whispers again, faint in my mind, a reminder that some things are better left untouched." Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never thought much about ghosts until I met one. It was the winter of 2016 when I moved into the old house on Barrett Street. It wasn't much, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath rental that had been sitting vacant for a while. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Dunley, gave me a good deal on the rent, though he was oddly reluctant to talk much about the house's history. I didn't press him on it. At the time, I was just relieved to find an affordable place after a rough breakup that had left me scrambling for somewhere to stay. The first few weeks were uneventful. Cold, drafty nights and the occasional creak in the floorboards, but nothing out of the ordinary. The house was old, after all. I spent most evenings curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the feeling of loneliness that settled in when the sun went down. It started with the knocking. At first, I assumed it was just the usual sounds an old house makes when it settles, but it was too deliberate. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. The first time I heard it, I was in the kitchen making tea. It came from the front door. I opened it, expecting to see a delivery or maybe a neighbor. There was no one there, just the empty porch and the snow-covered street beyond. The second time, it came from inside the house. I had just gone to bed when I heard it. 3 knocks, then 2, coming from the closet in the guest room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but something about the sound made my stomach clench. I started keeping the lights on at night. Then came the voices. Soft whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like someone was murmuring from the other side of a wall. I would catch faint words, but they never made sense. Just fragments of sentences that cut off before I could fully register them. One night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was slow and ragged, coming from the foot of my bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the lamp. Nothing was there. I barely slept after that. The air in the house changed. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on me. The corners of rooms seemed darker than they should be, shadows lingering just a little too long. And then, I saw her. It was late, past midnight. I was sitting in the living room trying to distract myself with a movie when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A woman stood in the hallway just outside the guest room. She was tall, thin, her face pale and sunken as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her hair was tangled, falling over her shoulders in loose, uneven strands. She wore a dress, old-fashioned, faded at the edges. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were hollow. Not empty, not black pits like in horror movies. Just hollow. Like they had seen too much, like they carried some unbearable weight. She didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. I could only sit there, frozen, my breath shallow and quick. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and walked into the guest room. The moment she disappeared, I bolted out of the house, not even bothering to grab a coat. I sat in my car, shaking, staring at the darkened windows. I knew I couldn't go back inside, not alone. I called my friend Jason, the only person I thought might believe me. He arrived within 20 minutes, groggy but concerned. When I told him what happened, he hesitated but agreed to check the house with me. Armed with flashlights, we stepped inside. The air was thick, suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave. We moved cautiously through the house, checking each room. Nothing seemed out of place until we reached the guest room. The closet door was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it earlier that day. Jason stepped closer, shining his light inside. At first, we saw nothing, just old paint peeling from the walls, a few forgotten coat hangers. Then, Jason took a sharp step back, swearing under his breath. "What?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away, just pointed. It took me a moment to see it. Carved into the wood, just inside the door, were words, faint but unmistakable. "Let me out." My stomach twisted. The letters were jagged, uneven, like they had been scratched in desperation. Jason grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." We spent the night at his place. I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The next morning, I called Mr. Dunley, demanding to know what had happened in that house. There was a long silence before he finally sighed. The previous tenant, a woman named Caroline. She lived there alone for years. She started acting strange, telling people she wasn't alone, that something in the house was watching her. I gripped the phone tighter. What happened to her? She disappeared. What do you mean, disappeared? No one knows. She just vanished. One night, she was there. The next morning, the house was empty. The police found no signs of struggle, like nothing missing. Just gone. I hung up and made arrangements to leave that same day. I didn't care about losing my deposit. I didn't care about finding a new place on short notice. I just needed to get out. As I packed my things, I felt it again, that heavy presence, watching, waiting. The air in the house was electric, charged with something I couldn't explain. Then came the knock. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 2 more. This time it came from the closet. I didn't look. I grabbed my bags, threw them into my car, and never looked back. I don't know what happened to Caroline. I don't know if she left, if she was taken, if something in that house still holds her. All I know is that when I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the guest room window. And she was there, standing, watching, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a sleepy town where everyone knew each other's name. It was the kind of place where neighbors would leave their doors unlocked and kids would ride their bikes down the street until the sun went down. For the most part, nothing ever happened there. Or so I thought. I was 24 when I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. It had been empty for years, and the previous owners had left under odd circumstances. People whispered about it, but no one ever mentioned exactly why they left. It was just one of those towns where rumors took on a life of their own. The farmhouse itself was a beautiful old structure, 2 stories with a large wraparound porch, faded yellow paint, and a tall, sagging roof. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the back had a neglected garden that looked like it hadn't seen care in decades. When I first saw the house, something about it drew me in. It felt like it had a story to tell, and I wanted to hear it. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but there was something about the house that gave off an unsettling vibe. Still, I was ready for a change. I had just ended a long-term relationship and was looking for a fresh start, and this house seemed like it could be the answer. I didn't pay much attention to the local gossip when I signed the lease. The price was right, and the place had character. I was excited to move in, but I quickly learned that character can be a double-edged sword. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and took a long shower to wash away the stress of the move. When I went to bed, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep almost immediately. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It started faintly at first, like the creak of a floorboard. I thought it was just the house settling. But then it came again, followed by a soft shuffling noise. My heart started to race, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The house was still. There was no wind, no rain, just silence. But the noises continued, the creak of footsteps faint but distinct. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the house with me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and checked every room. The house was empty. I checked the basement, the attic, and even the closets. Everything was in place, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling of being watched. The next few days went by without incident, and I began to think that maybe I had just imagined the noises. I went back to my routine: work, the gym, and dinner at home. But then, a few nights later, things started happening again. This time it was more than just sounds. I started noticing things moving around. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on the dining room table hours later. At first, I thought I was being careless. Maybe I was forgetting where I had placed things. But the pattern continued. Small things, like a glass of water I had left by the sink, would be sitting on the bookshelf in the living room. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I felt a chill in the air. I reached for the blanket to cover myself, but the air seemed to get colder and colder. It wasn't the kind of cold that just made you shiver. It was a deep, unnatural cold, like the kind you feel when someone walks over your grave. The temperature in the room dropped by at least 10 degrees, and I could see my breath in the air. I quickly turned off the TV and grabbed my phone to call a friend, but the phone screen froze. It wouldn't respond to touch. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house was silent again, but it felt wrong. It was like the walls were closing in on me. My phone finally started working again, and I called my friend Emma. When she answered, I tried to explain what was going on, but I was so freaked out that I could barely make sense of my words. She was concerned, but tried to calm me down. "Maybe you should just get out of the house for a bit. Go for a walk or something," she suggested. I agreed, grabbing my coat and heading out the door. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if something was truly off, but the fear was gnawing at me. As I walked around the property, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I couldn't help but feel that the house was watching me, even from a distance. The longer I stayed there, the more I began to feel like I was trapped, as if something was waiting for me to return to the house. That night, I went to bed with the covers pulled tightly around me. I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. The air still felt heavy, and I kept hearing faint noises in the walls, scratching like something was trying to get out. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just rats or the house settling. But the longer it went on, the more desperate it sounded. It wasn't just in the walls, it was coming from the floorboards too. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to leave the bed. I was frozen, unable to move. The scratching continued, growing louder and more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt oppressive, like something was waiting for me to do something, as if it was giving me time to make a decision. The next morning, I was drained, barely able to get out of bed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that the house was alive and it was coming for me. I thought about leaving, but the idea of just walking away felt like defeat. I had committed to this place, and I wasn't about to let my fear take over. Then it happened. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A shadow, dark, shapeless, and fleeting, swept across the room. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed away from the counter. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, overworked, or seeing things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on, hoping it would give me some peace of mind. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying not to listen to the creaking of the floorboards, the whispers in the walls. And then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, mournful voice, barely above a whisper, calling my name. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Lucy. I jumped out of bed and spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it should have been. I stood there for a long time, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. That's when I heard it again. This time, the voice was clearer, and it wasn't just calling my name, it was saying something else, something I couldn't quite make out. My blood ran cold. That was it. I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed a bag and packed my things, leaving everything behind in a panic. I didn't even bother to grab my keys. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached Emma's place. I never went back to the farmhouse. The landlord tried to reach me, but I never responded. I couldn't explain what happened, but I knew one thing for sure: I was not welcome there. I told Emma what had happened, and she didn't say much. She just listened, and then she told me something I'll never forget. "You know," she said, "that house has a history. People say the last tenants disappeared without a trace. The rumors say they were driven mad. I don't know what was in that house, and it was a ghost, a presence, or something else entirely. But I know one thing: something was waiting for me. And I'm lucky I got out when I did." Story the end.
Story number 4.
I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, a place where nothing much ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where kids ran around barefoot in the summer and the streets were empty at night. For the most part, I loved it. It was simple, safe, and unassuming. But there was one place in town that always unsettled me: the old house at the end of Maple Street. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. No one knew exactly who owned it, and there were rumors that it had been in the same family for generations. The house was large, Victorian, with dark wooden siding and a sagging roof. It had a long, winding driveway lined with overgrown hedges and a faded "for sale" sign that had been standing in front of it for as long as anyone could remember. The windows were always dark, and the front door was locked tight. But if you happened to walk by it on a particularly still evening, you might swear you heard something. A sound, a whisper, or even the faintest glimpse of a shadow in one of the windows. When I was a kid, I would dare my friends to sneak up to the house, to touch the front gate or peek through the window, but none of us ever had the guts to get too close. We all knew that there was something strange about the house, something that made us uneasy in a way we couldn't explain. It was just one of those places where you felt like someone was always watching, even though you couldn't see anyone. Then, when I was 24, something happened that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about the world. It started when I returned to my hometown after a few years away. I had been living in the city, but a job offer brought me back, and I was eager to reconnect with old friends and familiar places. One afternoon, I found myself driving down Maple Street, my eyes drifting to the old house at the end of the block. To my surprise, there was a "for rent" sign in the front yard. I couldn't believe it. After all these years, someone was renting the place out. I had heard rumors about the house being sold in the past, but nothing had ever come of it. Now, the thought of someone living in that house seemed almost impossible. Still, curiosity got the best of me, and I called the number on the sign. The voice on the other end was cheerful, almost too cheerful. The landlord, a man named Mr. Lawrence, said that the house had recently been refurbished and was now available for rent. He mentioned that it was a great deal for someone looking for a bit of space, and that the house had a certain character to it. He didn't go into much detail about the history of the house, but when I asked, he said it had been vacant for years because it was difficult to maintain, and that it needed a little love. Something about the way he said it stuck with me. But I was desperate for a place to live, and the price was too good to pass up. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in the following week. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was beautiful, if a little worn around the edges. The floors creaked when I walked on them, and the windows rattled in the wind, but nothing out of the ordinary for an old house. I spent the first few days unpacking, enjoying the solitude, and settling into my new life. But it didn't take long before the first strange occurrence happened. It was the middle of the night when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But then I heard them again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened carefully. There was no way it was the wind or the house settling. These were footsteps, someone walking down the hallway. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no one came in. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just the house groaning under its own weight. I lay back down and tried to fall asleep again, but the unsettling feeling of being watched never quite left me. The next morning, I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been working long hours, and the stress of the move had probably played tricks on my mind. But as the days went on, more strange things started happening. I would hear whispers, low, unintelligible voices coming from the walls. Sometimes when I was alone in the living room, I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. The shadows in the house seemed darker somehow, deeper than they should be, and the temperature would drop in certain rooms without explanation. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I was sitting in the kitchen eating dinner when I heard a loud bang from upstairs. I jumped, my fork clattering to the plate. I waited for a moment, hoping it was just a loose shutter or something that had fallen over. But the noise came again, a loud, unmistakable bang like a door slamming shut. My stomach churned with unease. I had to know what it was, so I got up and cautiously made my way upstairs. The door to the guest room, which I had left closed, was wide open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I stepped inside, heart pounding in my chest, and looked around. Nothing had moved, but the air in the room felt thick, heavy, as though the space was full of something that wasn't quite visible. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might indicate someone else was in the house, but everything was still. The house was silent. The following day, I went into town to pick up some groceries. When I returned, I found something that I couldn't explain. The front door was wide open. I had locked it before I left. I was sure of it. I stepped inside, calling out to see if anyone had entered while I was gone, but there was no answer. The house was empty, just as it should be. But something was wrong. The air felt dense, charged with a strange energy. I checked the windows. They were all locked, all secure. But the front door, it was as if it had been opened deliberately, and there was no sign of anyone around. I thought I was losing my mind, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was in the house with me. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that the house wasn't just old, that it wasn't just creaking and groaning because of its age. Maybe, just maybe, something was haunting it. I tried to push these thoughts out of my mind, but the incidents only escalated. The footsteps returned, louder now, closer. I would hear them walking through the hallway outside my bedroom door at night, sometimes stopping just outside. I would lie in bed, heart racing, too terrified to move or open the door. And then the whispers started again. This time, they weren't just unintelligible murmurs. I could make out words. My name. Come closer, it whispered. We're waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out to Mr. Lawrence, the landlord, and asked about the history of the house. He hesitated before answering, and when he did, his voice was tight, cautious. It's been empty for a long time, he said. The family that lived there before, well, they left under strange circumstances. No one really knows what happened to them. Some say they just vanished. Others say they were driven out by something in the house. His words chilled me to the bone. It was as if he knew exactly what I had been feeling, but he wasn't willing to admit it outright. I spent the next few days researching the history of the house, digging through old newspaper clippings and records at the library. What I found only made things worse. The family that had lived in the house before me had been well known in town, rich, respected, but mysteriously absent for years. No one could say exactly when they disappeared, but the rumors were all the same. They had left because of something in the house. Something evil. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. The house had been trying to tell me something, to warn me, and I had ignored it. I packed my bags and left that night, leaving the house behind with a sense of finality that I still can't explain. To this day, I don't know what haunted that house. Was it the spirits of the family that had once lived there? Or was it something far older, a presence that had been there long before them? All I know is that I'm glad I left, and I've never looked at an old house the same way again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never told anyone this story. Not in full, at least. It's not the kind of thing you bring up in casual conversation because either people don't believe you or worse, they do. And then they look at you like you're cursed. It happened almost 10 years ago, but even now I hesitate to talk about it. The memories haven't faded. If anything, they've only gotten sharper, like wounds that refuse to close. I was 23 when I moved into the house on Pine Hollow Road. It was my first time living alone, and despite the isolation, miles from the nearest town, I loved it. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and walls that whispered in the wind. It had been empty for years before I moved in, the landlord eager to rent it out for cheap. At the time, I thought I'd found a hidden gem. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first few nights were quiet. I spent my days unpacking, fixing up small things around the house, making it feel like home. There was a strange energy in the place, but I chalked it up to being alone for the first time. I convinced myself I was just getting used to the silence. Then, the noises started. At first, it was nothing unusual. A creak in the hallway when no one was there, a door shifting slightly, even though the windows were closed. Old houses make noise, I told myself, but the sounds became more distinct, more deliberate. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard footsteps, slow, measured steps coming from the hallway just outside the bathroom. I froze, my toothbrush still in my mouth. The footsteps stopped. I turned off the faucet and listened, my heart pounding. Silence. After a moment, I forced myself to look. The hallway was empty. I tried to shake it off, but a feeling of unease settled over me. I kept the bathroom light on that night. A few nights later, I woke up to a strange sound. Knocking. It was soft at first. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up in bed, my pulse hammering. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. It was coming from inside the house. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but something about the rhythm felt intentional, almost expectant. I told myself not to be ridiculous. I got up, grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed, and walked toward the sound. It was coming from the basement door. I stood there, gripping the bat, listening. Silence. I reached out and turned the handle. The door was locked. I let out a shaky breath, relieved. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe I was just imagining things. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The knocking happened again the next night. And the next. Always at 3:15 a.m. Always the same pattern. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. I started keeping the lights on. I moved my bed away from the basement door, sleeping on the couch instead. But no matter where I went in the house, I could still hear it. Then, one night, something changed. The knocking stopped. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. When I woke up, I felt more rested than I had in ages. I convinced myself it had all been in my head, until I saw the scratches. They were on the inside of the basement door. Deep, jagged marks, as if something had been clawing to get out. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I reached out, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I shoved a chair under the handle. At 3:15 a.m., I woke up, not to knocking, to whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind, but I could hear it. Low, breathy words spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, frozen, listening. The whispers grew louder. Then the doorknob started to turn. I stopped breathing. The chair under the door handle shifted slightly, creaking against the floor. Something was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. The whispering stopped. The doorknob stilled. For a long moment there was silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow, shuffling steps, moving away from my door, toward the basement. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to my friend Jason's house. I told him I was having issues with the house, strange noises, flickering lights. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. Jason was skeptical but agreed to come back with me that night. We arrived at the house around 10 p.m. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Jason checked the basement door. "You said it was locked?" I nodded. He reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open. The air that rushed out was ice cold. I shone my flashlight down the stairs. The basement was empty. Dust covered the floor, untouched. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been down there. Then Jason pointed at something. Carved into the wooden door beneath the scratches were words. "Let me out!" We left immediately. I never spent another night in that house. The next day I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't argue. He just sighed and said, "You lasted longer than most." I moved in with Jason for a few months until I could find a new place. I tried to put it behind me to forget. But sometimes late at night, when I'm alone, I still hear it. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that house never really left. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It had been an unremarkable Friday evening when Jane decided to stop by the old thrift store in the middle of town. The small, tucked-away shop always intrigued her, but she never seemed to find the time to explore it. On this particular night, the streets were quieter than usual, as if the world had retreated into the shadows. A pale, amber glow from the streetlights bathed the sidewalk, giving everything a dreamy, almost ethereal quality. The store itself looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The sign above the door was cracked and peeling, and the glass windows displayed an odd collection of forgotten trinkets: old porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, faded photographs, and yellowing books. A bell jingled softly as Jane pushed the door open, and the musky scent of dust and aged wood greeted her as she stepped inside. It was cold in there. Despite the chill in the air, the store was surprisingly well lit, and Jane could make out the narrow aisles lined with cluttered shelves. There was a distinct sense of being watched, though it didn't feel threatening, more like the store itself had some sort of peculiar life. It seemed as though the items on the shelves were waiting for someone to take them home. The storekeeper, an elderly man with white, wispy hair and a crooked back, was standing behind the counter, his eyes half closed as if lost in thought. Jane could barely make out his face, but his presence made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but there was something about his stillness that felt unnatural. The bell jingled again as another customer entered. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s wearing a long leather jacket. He appeared a little out of place, his boots clicking with each step as he walked deeper into the shop, eyes scanning the shelves. Jane was suddenly overcome by an eerie sensation, like the shop was drawing her in, urging her to explore further. Her eyes landed on a particular shelf at the back of the store. Something about it caught her attention. A framed photograph, one that seemed oddly out of place in this jumble of forgotten objects. The picture was old, black and white, and showed a young girl standing in front of a house, her eyes vacant, staring directly into the camera. There was something unsettling about the way her expression seemed to linger, frozen in time, as if the photo was capturing something far beyond the moment it was taken. Curiosity gnawed at Jane. She moved toward the shelf, drawn like a moth to a flame. As her fingers brushed against the frame, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Her eyes widened as she noticed a strange detail, a shadow behind the girl in the photograph. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but as Jane focused harder, she realized the shadow wasn't cast by anything in the room. It was too dark, too defined. It looked almost alive. The old man behind the counter cleared his throat, and Jane snapped out of her trance, pulling her hand away from the photograph as though it had burned her. She turned to face him, but he was already walking toward her with a slow, deliberate gait. "You've found her," he said, his voice raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. Jane's heart skipped a beat. What? What do you mean?" she stammered. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly leaned forward, peering over his glasses at the photo. His eyes flickered with something Jane couldn't quite read, but it sent a jolt of unease through her. "She's not just a photograph," he muttered, almost to himself. "She's a reminder, a warning." "Warning?" Jane echoed, her voice small. "What do you mean? What's the story behind this picture?" The shopkeeper smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a tight-lipped, knowing smile. "That picture has been here for longer than you can imagine, and so has she." Suddenly, the man in the leather jacket appeared at her side, his deep voice interrupting the tension. "You don't want to know about her," he said softly, almost like he was speaking from experience. Jane turned to him, feeling the sudden weight of the conversation pressing on her. "Why? What's wrong with her?" The man glanced at the photograph and then back at Jane. His eyes were hollow, haunted. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "It's not the picture itself," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's what happens to anyone who gets too close to it." A cold gust of wind rattled the door behind them, and Jane instinctively glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one else in sight. The bell above the door tinkled softly, and the old man behind the counter chuckled darkly. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice echoing in the small shop. "The presence. She's been waiting for you." Jane felt her stomach twist in knots. She didn't know what was happening, why, but a feeling of dread settled over her like a heavy blanket. Without warning, the man in the leather jacket grabbed her arm, his grip firm and urgent. "Get out of here. Now." Before she could protest, he pulled her toward the door, and the old man's laugh rang out behind them. "Once she's marked you, it's too late. There's no escaping her." The door slammed shut behind them, and Jane stood on the sidewalk, heart pounding. The night air felt unusually cold, and the shadows seemed to loom larger than before. "What was that?" Jane gasped, looking at the man who had pulled her out of the store. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed the street, making sure no one was watching them. His face was tense, as though the weight of some long-buried memory had resurfaced. Finally, he looked at Jane and spoke in a low voice. "You're in danger now." "What?" Jane's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What danger? What do you mean?" The man sighed deeply, his eyes darkening with a mix of regret and fear. "Her name is Emily. She's been haunting that store for decades, and anyone who comes too close to her, whether they want to or not, gets pulled into her curse." "I don't understand," Jane whispered. "What does she want?" The man looked around again, as though making sure they weren't being followed, and then he leaned in closer. "She doesn't want anything, not really. She just wants to be seen, and when someone sees her, really sees her, she takes them." Jane felt her pulse quicken, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Takes them? What do you mean? Where does she take them?" The man's gaze darkened. "You won't find out until it's too late. Trust me, you don't want to find out." A silence hung between them as Jane tried to process what he was saying. The street seemed to grow quieter still, the distant hum of the city muffled, as if the world had grown eerily still in the wake of this revelation. Finally, Jane spoke, her voice trembling. "What do I do? How do I get rid of it?" The man looked at her with pity in his eyes. "You can't. Once she's chosen you, there's no escaping her. You'll start seeing her everywhere, in your dreams, in reflections, in shadows. She'll follow you until she gets what she wants." And then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the street. Jane stood there, alone and trembling, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was already watching her, waiting. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at the thrift store. The windows, once dimly lit, now seemed to flicker with a strange, unnatural glow. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the figure of a girl standing in the window, her pale face peering out at her from the darkness, and then the window went black. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I was never one to believe in ghosts. Even after we moved into that house, after the strange noises, the missing objects, the feeling of being watched, I still told myself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks, houses settle, and old buildings have their quirks. That's what I believed, what I wanted to believe, until the night I saw her. It started with little things. My husband, Mark, and I had just bought a house in a small New England town, a place with history, the kind of house that people described as having character. It was over 100 years old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The real estate agent had mentioned that the previous owners had left abruptly, but we didn't think much of it. People move for all sorts of reasons. The first time I noticed something was off was about a week after we moved in. Mark had gone to the store and I was unpacking alone in the kitchen. I had just set down a wooden spoon on the counter when I heard a soft clatter behind me. Turning around, I saw that the spoon was now on the floor, several feet away from where I had placed it. I frowned. Picking it up, maybe I had knocked it over without realizing it, but as I stood up, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if something unseen was in the room with me. I shook off the feeling and went back to work, but that unease lingered. That night, as we lay in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was pacing just outside our bedroom door. Mark stirred beside me. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, sitting up. Probably just the house settling. But the sound didn't stop. He got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty. "There's nothing there," he said, but he sounded unsure. I didn't sleep well that night. The following days, the disturbances grew worse. I'd leave the room only to return and find cabinets open, chairs pulled slightly away from the table, objects moved from where I had left them. At first, I thought Mark was playing tricks on me, but he swore he wasn't. And then there was the feeling, like I was never truly alone in that house. The worst of it started one evening when I was home alone. Mark had gone on a business trip, and I was settling in for a quiet night. I had just sat down on the couch with a book when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a woman humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, like a lullaby. I froze, my skin prickling with goosebumps. The sound was coming from upstairs. Slowly I stood, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I took a hesitant step toward the staircase, listening. The humming continued, faint but distinct. It was coming from the guest bedroom. I considered calling Mark, but what would I even say? That there was a ghost humming in our house? That I was scared of something I couldn't see? I took a deep breath and forced myself up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound loud in the silence. As I approached the guest bedroom, the humming stopped. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the rocking chair by the window was moving. It swayed back and forth, creaking softly against the wooden floor. A slow, steady rhythm, as if someone had just been sitting there, watching, waiting. I turned and ran, locking myself in my bedroom for the rest of the night. Mark returned the next day, and I told him everything. He was skeptical, of course, but he could see how shaken I was. That night, he slept with a baseball bat beside the bed, just in case. Then 2 nights later, I saw her. I woke up around 3 a.m, feeling strange, like something had pulled me from sleep. The room was cold, unnaturally so. My breath fogged slightly in the air. I turned over, expecting to see Mark sleeping beside me, but he wasn't there. And then I saw movement in the corner of the room. A figure. A woman. She stood near the window, her back turned to me. Long, tangled hair cascaded down her back, and she wore a dress that looked old, tattered. My mouth went dry. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure twitched. Then, slowly, unnaturally, she turned her head toward me. Not her body, just her head. Her eyes were sunken, hollow, her mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. A whisper, barely a breath, escaped her lips. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I gasped, bolting upright just as Mark came back into the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. I stared at him, my body trembling. I saw her, I whispered. She was right there. He looked toward the empty corner. Who? The woman, the one who's been here this whole time. Mark didn't believe me. Not entirely. But after that night, he admitted that something about the house felt wrong. The atmosphere had changed. Shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, the whispers grew more frequent, and sometimes at night, we both heard it, the humming. We started digging into the history of the house, desperate for answers. What we found only made things worse. The house had belonged to a woman named Eleanor West. In the late 1800s, she had lived there with her husband and young son. One winter, her husband vanished, leaving no trace. The townspeople whispered that he had run off with another woman, but Eleanor refused to believe it. She stayed in the house, waiting for him, convinced he would return. He never did. Years later, her son fell ill and died in the very room where I had seen her. After that, Eleanor was never the same. The neighbors spoke of her wandering the house at night, rocking in her chair, humming lullabies to a child who was no longer there. Then one day she too disappeared. No body was ever found. The house was left abandoned for decades. Until we moved in, we left the house soon after. Whatever was there, it didn't want us there, and we weren't about to stay and find out what would happen if we ignored the warnings. The day we moved out, as we were loading the last of our things into the car, I heard it one final time. A soft, distant humming. A lullaby. As we drove away, I looked up at the guest bedroom window, and there she was, standing in the window, watching, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard stories. Who hasn't? But I always chalked them up to overactive imaginations, tricks of the mind, or even just good storytelling. That was before I moved into the house on Sycamore Street. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After my divorce, I needed to get away from everything. Away from the memories, the looks of pity from friends, the empty bed that felt too big at night. I found the house listed online. It was old but well kept, and the rent was surprisingly cheap for a place with so much space. A 2-story Victorian, tucked at the edge of town where the streetlights didn't quite reach. The landlord, a man named Mr. Grayson, seemed eager to get it rented. When I asked why the price was so low, he just shrugged and said, "People don't stay long." I should have asked more questions. The first week was quiet. I spent my days unpacking, painting over the faded wallpaper, and trying to turn the house into something that felt like home. At night, though, it was different. It started with the knocking. I remember the first time it happened. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. 3 slow knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound had come from downstairs. My first thought was that someone was at the door, but when I checked, the porch was empty. The street outside was still, not a single car or person in sight. I locked the door and told myself it was just the house settling. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night, just after midnight, always the same pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. I tried to ignore it until the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I started hearing words, faint, just at the edge of hearing. Get out. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The air in the house felt heavy, charged. Some nights I'd wake up gasping, feeling like something unseen was pressing down on my chest. Other nights I'd hear footsteps moving through the house when I knew I was alone. Then one night, I saw her. I had fallen asleep on the couch, an old horror movie playing softly in the background. I woke up to the sound of breathing, not mine. It was slow, shallow, coming from just behind me. I turned my head, expecting to see nothing, but she was there. A woman stood in the doorway to the kitchen, barely visible in the dim light from the TV. She was tall and thin, her skin pale and stretched too tight over her bones. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Her dress, old, tattered, clung to her like it had been damp for years. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She lifted her head slightly, and I saw her eyes, hollow, sunken, filled with something dark and endless. She opened her mouth, and I knew she was about to speak. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember unlocking the door. I just remember being outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called Jason, the only person who wouldn't think I was crazy. He didn't ask questions. He just told me to come over. I didn't go back inside that night. The next morning, Jason came with me to check the house. Nothing was out of place, no sign of anyone else being there, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew she was still there. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, told myself I'd find another place, but every time I walked toward the door, something stopped me. Not physically, just a feeling. Like if I left, something worse would happen. So I stayed. The knocking continued. The whispers grew louder. And then, one night, the closet door in my bedroom opened on its own. It was slow, deliberate. A long, creaking groan as the darkness inside seemed to stretch outward. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Scratched into the wood inside the closet were words. "Let me out!" I left that night and never went back. I didn't tell Mr. Grayson why. I didn't want to know if he already knew. I just packed what I could, got in my car, and drove until the house was nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more, story the end.
Story number 9.
I never believed in ghosts, not in the way you hear about in horror stories. Sure, I'd heard strange things before, unexplained noises, a door creaking when no one was near it, but I always found a reason for it. The wind, old pipes, my imagination. I thought people who claimed to experience hauntings were either exaggerating or lying outright. That changed when I moved into the house on Holloway Drive. It was an old farmhouse built in the late 1800s. I found it listed for an unbelievably low price, and even though it needed some work, I jumped at the chance. A fresh start. A place all my own. The previous owners had left in a hurry. The real estate agent, a nervous woman in her 60s, didn't say much about them. When I pressed her, she finally admitted they claimed the house wasn't empty. I laughed. "What does that mean?" She hesitated before answering. "They said they weren't alone, that something was here." I wanted to roll my eyes. Instead, I just nodded and signed the paperwork. I wasn't going to let superstition scare me away from a great deal. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was quiet, aside from the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. I kept myself busy with unpacking, repainting, making it feel like home. I even convinced myself that the eerie feeling I sometimes got, like I was being watched, was just my mind playing tricks. But then, things started happening. Small things at first. I'd wake up to find cabinet doors open that I knew I'd closed. Objects would be in different places than I had left them. Once, I came back from work to find every single light in the house turned on. I blamed myself. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe I had left the lights on. Maybe I just didn't remember. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, the air heavy. I turned on the lamp and listened. Silence. I tried to shake it off, but as I lay back down, it happened again. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. It was coming from inside the house. I got up, my breath shallow, and walked toward the hallway. The sound came again, this time from the guest bedroom. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating. The air was ice cold. I opened the door. The room was empty. I stood there for a long moment, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the house was settling, or maybe I had imagined it. But then I noticed something. The rocking chair by the window was moving, just a little, back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a draft. Houses creak, things move. There was nothing to be afraid of. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night, just past midnight, always the same pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more, and then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a distant voice carried on the wind. But it grew louder over time. Some nights I'd hear my name. Other nights I'd hear something worse. "Get out!" The words were clear, unmistakable, and they weren't coming from outside. I started keeping the lights on. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I spent nights in the living room with the TV playing just to drown out the silence. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was there. Watching, waiting. Then one night, I saw her. I had dozed off on the couch when I woke up suddenly, my throat dry, my body rigid with a sense of unease I couldn't explain. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, heavy, suffocating. And then I saw movement in the hallway. A figure. A woman. She stood just at the edge of the dim light coming from the TV, her form barely visible. Tall, thin, dressed in something old-fashioned tattered at the edges. Her face was obscured by a mass of tangled, matted hair. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She didn't walk. She glided. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, not her body, just her head. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the entire room, and then she was gone. I ran out of the house that night. Jason, my best friend, was the only person I could call who might believe me. He let me stay at his place, though he looked skeptical when I told him what happened. The next morning, he agreed to come back with me to check the house. Everything was normal. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed. Except for one thing. On the inside of the closet door in the guest bedroom, something had been scratched into the wood. "Let me out." I left the house that day. I packed a bag, called my landlord, and told him I was breaking my lease. I didn't care about penalties. I didn't care about money. I just needed to get out. Mr. Grayson didn't argue. He simply sighed and said, "You lasted longer than most." I don't know who or what I saw in that house. I don't know if she was a ghost, a shadow of something that had once been, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I still hear it. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I never thought of myself as someone who would believe in ghosts. Like most people, I'd heard my fair share of creepy stories, but I always chalked them up to overactive imaginations or tricks of the mind. That was before I moved into the apartment on Holloway Street. I had just started a new job in a small town in upstate New York and needed a place to stay. The rental market was tight, and when I found a 1-bedroom apartment at an unbelievably low price, I jumped at it. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Winslow, was pleasant but had a strange air about her. When I asked why the rent was so low, she just gave me a thin smile and said, "It's been empty for a while. Not everyone stays." I should have asked more questions. The apartment itself was fine, small, outdated, but nothing too unusual. The first few days were normal. I spent my time unpacking, arranging my furniture, and getting used to my new routine. The only thing that felt a little off was the bedroom. It was colder than the rest of the apartment, no matter how high I turned up the heat. I figured it was just poor insulation and made a mental note to buy an extra blanket. Then the noises started. At first, it was just small things, a soft creaking sound in the middle of the night, a faint scratching like something moving behind the walls. Nothing that couldn't be explained by an old building settling. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 more. It was coming from inside the apartment. I sat up, heart pounding. My bedside lamp cast a dim glow across the room, but everything looked normal. The knocking had sounded like it came from the closet. I told myself it was nothing, maybe something shifting inside, an old pipe knocking against the wall. I got up, walked over, and opened the closet door. Empty, just my clothes, shoes, and the musty smell of old wood. I closed the door and got back into bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The knocking happened again the next night, and the next. Always the same pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. I started sleeping with the lights on. A week later, I came home from work and found my closet door open. I knew for a fact I had closed it that morning. I stood in the doorway, staring at it, trying to convince myself I had just forgotten. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The air in the bedroom felt heavier that night. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets up to my chin, forcing myself to think about anything else. That was when I heard the whispering. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, like someone murmuring in another room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill through my body. I told myself it was the wind, the pipes, my imagination. Then something moved. I didn't see it, not exactly. But in the reflection of the mirror across the room, I saw the shadow shift. Not my shadow. Something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked if anyone had ever mentioned strange things happening in the apartment. There was a long pause before she sighed. "You should come by. I'll tell you what I know." I drove to her house that evening. She invited me in, poured me a cup of tea, and sat across from me at her kitchen table. The last tenant, her name was Anna, she began. She lived there for about a year. I nodded, waiting. She started complaining about noises, knocking at night, whispering. She thought someone was in the apartment, but there was never any sign of a break-in. A knot tightened in my stomach. One night she called me, hysterical, said she saw something, a woman, standing in her bedroom. The room felt colder. She moved out the next day. Mrs. Winslow sighed. She left everything behind, furniture, clothes, everything. She just disappeared. I tried to track her down, but she never answered my calls. I gripped my cup, my hands shaking slightly, and before her, she hesitated. It's happened before. Tenants don't last long there. They always leave. I swallowed. Has anyone ever died there? She hesitated, then nodded. Years ago, a woman named Margaret lived there. She was troubled. People said she talked to herself, claimed something was in the apartment with her. One night, she locked herself in the closet. They found her days later. My breath caught in my throat. She had scratched at the door, over and over, like she was trying to claw her way out. A chill ran down my spine. I left soon after, driving back in silence, my mind racing. When I got home, I went straight to the bedroom, heart pounding. I stood in front of the closet door, hesitating. Slowly, I reached out and pulled it open. The air inside was freezing. I ran my fingers along the wood inside the door. At first, it felt smooth. Then I found them, scratches, deep, uneven grooves. My stomach turned. I grabbed my phone and called Jason, my best friend. You need to come over, now. He arrived within 30 minutes. I told him everything. The knocking, the whispering, the story about Margaret. He didn't laugh. He just nodded, grabbed a flashlight, and started looking around. When he got to the closet, he stopped. There's something here, he muttered. He pulled out his phone and shone the light inside. That's when we saw it. Carved into the wood, just beneath the scratches, were the words, "Let me out." I left that night and never went back. I broke my lease, packed what little I could, and moved in with Jason until I found another place. I don't know who or what I saw in that apartment, but sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I still hear it. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more, story the end.